Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. The podcast is a production of a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. When we are making sense of our world, we are inherently using our brain. God designed the human brain to be this incredible sense-making machine within us. So, getting better at making sense of the world means our brain getting better, which raises the question, is there a way for our brain to get better? Dr. Lee Warren believes there is a way for all of us to do this. Dr. Warren knows the brain. He is a neurosurgeon, an award-winning author, and an Iraq war veteran, and the host of the Dr. Lee Warren podcast. He teaches on the art of connecting neuroscience, Christian faith, and daily practices. Here's my conversation with Dr. Warren. So welcome, Lee, to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Curtis. Thanks.
Well, let's get to the central concept of your book, which is very well articulated in the very title, The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery. So let's start off. What exactly is self-brain surgery?
Well, it's not as dangerous as it sounds, so I'm not advocating that anybody cut their heads open. It just turns out that our brains are not what many of us think. Many of us have been raised to believe that we're sort of the product of the way that our brain works and that we're sort of stuck with it. If you had the wrong parents or the wrong upbringing or you went through the wrong kind of circumstances, then your brain doesn't work the right way, that you're kind of stuck with that. But it turns out that 21st century neuroscience has taught us very, very clearly now that your brain is constantly changing. It changes its connections between its cells every second of your life, and it makes new cells every day of your life. And that the primary driver of that structural change of your brain is the stuff you think about. And so that means if we learn to think different thoughts, then our brains literally become different brains. And so the idea of controlling how your brain behaves by learning to control what your mind does and understanding that there's a difference between your mind and your brain is just as real of the surgery as I perform in the operating room when I do brain surgery on people.
So whereas you use these highly specialized mechanical instruments to change something happening in the brain, you're talking about changing thoughts as kind of the scalpel, if you will, of how brain surgery works. So
that's right.
That's a great analogy. It's very captivating. How does the analogy work between the neurosurgeons like yourselves, scalpel, and the average layperson's thoughts? Where does that analogy work? Where might it break down?
Well, it works because in a literal sense, when your brain changes what it does, then what it does is literally structurally cuts a connection between neurons or groups of neurons. There's a thing called a synapse in your brain that connects one cell to another. And that's how neuronal activity is propagated through your brain. So when you think a thought, it turns into one neuron firing and connecting to another neuron, and that trillions of neurons get involved, or trillions of synapses get involved to connect hundreds of billions of neurons. And so literally changing what you think about is the agent that causes the cutting and reconnection of those cells. And so the analogy holds that just like I do in the operating room, I pick up a knife and I sever part of the brain to cut a tumor out or to make something stop happening. If you're having seizures, I try to cut those neurons so the electrons can't fire. So it holds up really well in the way that you can think about it, because it's actually literally what's happening. So when you think about one thing and not another thing, your brain says, okay, I'm supposed to do something different than I was doing before with my structural connections. And it begins to lay down new pipes, if you will, new wires, and you literally rewire your brain in response to your thinking. So it holds up really well. I think where it might not hold up as well is when people say, well, if you think about it as a metaphor, for example, if you think about it as just a way of thinking, and you don't understand that this process, the real process, the neuroscience process that we're describing here is called neuroplasticity. The neuroplasticity is the science of what happens when a cell connects to another cell in your brain, and that is constantly changing. So that neuroplasticity process is the structural thing that's happening on the cellular level. And what happens is if you don't recognize that process continues to happen 24/7 of your entire life, whether you're thinking one thought or another, that process is reconnecting itself all the time, happening all the time. But the problem is about 80% of the things that we think about automatically, about 80% of the thoughts that pop into your head and 80% of the things that you feel aren't true. There's good research to show that now, that most of us have automatic thoughts that are not true. And if it turns out that the things you think about are what drives the structural change in your brain, and that most of the things that most of us think about all the time aren't true, that means that we're recreating structural things happening in our brain that aren't serving us well because they're not based on good data in the first place. There's other research that's interesting that shows that about 90% of the things that we repetitively think about are the same from day to day. So that means that most of us have a set of thoughts that we think all the time, every day. We think about our marriage, our wives, our jobs, our money, or whatever, our kids. And we think about the same things and we worry about the same things day after day after day. And if it's those repetitive thoughts that are driving the structural changes in our brain, and if we're thinking the same thoughts every day, then we're just recreating the same structures in our brain every day. That is how we begin to believe that we can't change. And that's how we begin to develop hopelessness around things that we've struggled with, habits that we can't seem to kick, or attitudes that we can't seem to shake, or repetitive negative thinking that we can't seem to get rid of. It's because we're writing the same program in our brain every day.
Okay, so you're talking about this scope of life that seems to be opened up as a potential for change if we adopt this notion that our brains can change. And that's really the first part of your title of your book, The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery. So connect these two halves of your title. Can you give us some examples of how this self-brain surgery, or changing our thoughts the way you're describing, how could this change one's life?
Well, I'll give you a really personal one, Curtis. 2013, my son Mitchell was stabbed to death. My 19-year-old son died. And as a practicing neurosurgeon and somebody who had been trained in the traditional school of neuroscience, where I sort of taught for many years, I taught students that you're kind of stuck with the brain that you have. If we didn't understand neuroplasticity yet until the early 2000s. I have lost a son, and I'm devastated by that, and I'm overwhelmed with negative thinking. And when you lose a child or go through anything really traumatic, you hear these thoughts all the time. This is always going to hurt this bad. It's never going to be okay again. My family's going to be wrecked. I know all the research about how marriages have a hard time surviving, losing a child, all that stuff starts to play in your mind, and you begin to believe that your future is going to look just like today does. And you're going to feel the same things every day. And my wife and I, Lisa ran our practice at the time. We lived in Auburn, Alabama, and our office was on the third floor of a building at the Auburn University campus. And on the first floor of that building was an MRI research center where they were doing this groundbreaking, what they called functional MRI scanning. And that was brand new in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. Functional MRI is where you put somebody in a scanner, and instead of just taking a picture of their brain or their heart or whatever you're looking at, you can actually see what the organ is doing at the cellular level in the functional scanner. And so about a month after Mitch died, we went back to work because we had to. We had employees, and I was the only doctor, and we were going to lose our business if we didn't go back to work. So we had to go back to work, even though I didn't feel like it. And so we went back to work, and a few days later, we were invited down to a meeting at the research lab to watch some of these functional scans happen. And because I was grieving and hurting and not really feeling like working very much, I went down to that meeting to have something to do for that hour. And Lisa and I were standing in the control room, and they had this woman in the scanner who had a pair of headphones on. And they said, just lie there for a moment, let us calibrate the machine. And you could see that her brain wasn't actively doing anything. It was just kind of calm. She was just sitting there. And then they said to her over the headphones, they said, okay, Mrs. Johnson, think about the worst thing you've ever felt in your life. Like, think about the hardest thing you've ever encountered. And whatever it was, you could see her sort of processing that. And then her brain began to light up in the areas of the brain that are involved in fear and hard memories. Amygdala, the limbic system that's involved in fight or flight and all of those things starts to light up, and that part of the brain gets really active that's involved in hardship and pain. And then shortly after the brain began to react to her thinking, her body began to react. Her heart rate went up, and her blood pressure went up, and her respiratory rate went up. So we saw her think about something, and then we saw her brain do something, and then we saw her body do something. And then after a moment, they said, okay, Mrs. Johnson, stop thinking about that hard thing And now think about the best thing you've ever felt in your whole life, the best day you can remember, your happiest memory. And shortly after they told her to think about something different, her frontal lobes began to light up. Different parts of her brain began to fire, and the amygdala began to calm down, and the hardship stuff, the fear-based stuff started calming down. And shortly after that, her blood pressure got better, her heart rate came down, and her respiratory rate came down. And we saw her change what she was thinking about, and that improved what her brain was doing, and that improved what her body was doing. And my wife said that reminded her of Philippians chapter 4, which was what talks in the Bible. There's this part of Philippians 4 that talks about if you don't want to be anxious, be grateful instead, or think about this and you'll be less anxious. And I saw with my eyes that if you can learn to think about a different set of things, your brain will reliably do a different set of things, and it'll make your body work better. And so for me, that was life-changing, because then I saw that, yes, I'm grieved, yes, I'm bereaved, and yes, I'm hearing all these thoughts in my brain that it's doom and gloom and it's always going to be this way and that this is going to define my future. But if I can think about it in a different way, it doesn't have to define my future in the same way. And so it literally, that was the moment that my life began to crawl up out of that hole after having lost my son. I began to connect things in a different way, to see that two things can be true at once. Like I can be grieved, but I can also still have a purpose, and there can still be a future for me. And I can learn to navigate this in a way that maybe can benefit me in some way down the road, because I can learn to use it to help other people or whatever. So when I titled the book, The Life-Changing Art, it's not all science, because there's some art to learning how to be a good human, right? But it's life-changing in the sense that if you believe that you're stuck with the brain that you have, and you believe that your brain always tells you the truth, then you really have to be pretty hopeless, because if you got the wrong brain, you were raised in the wrong house, you went through the wrong stuff, and that can damage your brain in a way that you can't recover from, you don't have any hope of that getting better in the future. But once you understand that it's never been the things that you go through that writes the story of your future, it's always been the response that you chose, or the response that you developed to those hard things, that tells the story of your future. Once you understand that, and that you have agency and you have control over the responses that you choose, then you can always know that your brain will reliably help you write a different response in the future. And that gives you tremendous agency and hope that the future doesn't have to look like the past did. So I wasn't being hyperbolic when I said it can change your life. Like, it saved my life. Like this process of understanding you have this control really can change your life.
Well, it's a very profound story. Thank you for sharing that. And it is a great illustration that, as you describe in your book, there's a difference between our brain and, I guess, our minds, that in our mind has a certain agency that actually exerts some influence over our brain and then cascades down to our body.
That's right.
Let's talk more about what our practices, specific practices that we can do to actually exercise our mind rather than being captive to our existing brain.
Yeah. So I think this is why a period in the morning where you spend some time thinking about your upcoming day and preparing your responses to the things you're likely to encounter is very helpful practice to develop. And that's because there's a book that a guy named Chris Voss wrote, a book called Never Split the Difference. He's a hostage negotiator for the FBI. And he had this line in there where he said, when the pressure's on, we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to our preparation. And that line stuck with me because it's true in the neuroplasticity sense that if you repeatedly think about something from a particular perspective, your brain begins to filter and to lay down pipes, if you will, synapses, to reinforce your ability to carry out the thing that you tell it to care about or to think about or intend to do. And so that means, as a practice, if you're dealing with a repetitive negative thought, or you're dealing with a situation that you're having trouble overcoming, if you know that when you get to work and you have a meeting at a certain time every day, and your boss gives you a hard time and you tend to blow up or get in trouble, or you tend to react in the same way every day, if instead of that, if in the morning on that day, you start to think about the day and you start to anticipate that moment, and you start to tell your brain, okay, I know that when I'm under pressure, I tend to react in this way, and it doesn't help me. It doesn't serve me well. So instead, plan some responses and tell them to your brain as if they're actually happening. There's some really interesting neuroscience research that says that the brain lacks the ability to discern between something that's actually happening and something that we're just imagining. And it turns out this has been used very well by fighter pilots and professional musicians and Olympic athletes and all kinds of people who have realized that visualization actually begins to wire your brain as if you're doing the thing that you're thinking about. And there's this famous video on the internet of the Blue Angels, the Navy fighter pilots. They're sitting in a conference room and they've all got their eyes closed and they're mimicking the control movements that they're going to take in their upcoming flight. And they're saying their radio calls to each other. They've got their eyes closed. And there's been functional imaging research done in musicians to show that spending that visualization time actually prepares the brain. And when they actually perform the events, they're about 25% more effective than when they didn't go through that preparatory process. So in terms of a practice you can develop, spending that morning time sort of planning, telling your brain how you want it to respond, visualizing the response as if it's actually happening. You're not just being kind of metaphorical and sort of doing some self-help trick. You're literally wiring your brain to repeat that process when the pressure's actually on. So you're building a brain that's going to support you to make a better outcome in that moment than if you just wander into the day and let it surprise you like it always does.
You know, Lee, I think we should have gotten on beforehand and just closed our eyes together and visualized all the conversational moves.
This conversation we should have.
Yeah, exactly. You adverted to earlier about this moment when your son died, how you connected an insight about neuroscience that you were witnessing very much before you in this fMRI machine, and a biblical verse from Philippians, and you made that connection. I would like you to sort of expand on that, both as a committed Christian and as a highly skilled neurosurgeon, like connect the dots between this sort of realm of science, in particular neurosurgery, and the biblical worldview. What have you found to be important bridges?
Yeah, so the Philippians 4 is a great example because so you have this guy named Paul in the first century AD, so 2,000 years ago, right? Essentially, who writes, "Don't be anxious for anything, but in everything with prayer and thanksgiving, present your request to God." And there's this weird coda to that sentence. He says, "And the peace of God, which passes understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds." Okay, so he says, don't be anxious, be grateful instead, and you'll be filled with peace. And then he gives another verse where he lists all these things you can think about instead of anxiety. He says, whatever is lovely and good and true and noble, and all this whole list of things that you can think about. They're basically transplants. You could transplant this thought for an anxious one and you'll have a better life. He says that. Then now we fast forward to the 21st century and we have functional imaging research that shows that you literally cannot be grateful and anxious at the same time. And the reason why you can't is there's a part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is sometimes called the security guard of your brain because its primary function is, well, it's got multiple functions, one of which is memory retrieval and all of that. But another one, a really important one, is that it looks out for threats. Your hippocampus is scanning your environment to search for things that might be threatening to you and is deciding whether you need to run away. In that case, it's going to trigger a blood flow to the amygdala, which is a part of your brain that's involved in emotion and fear. And it's going to trigger what we call the fight or flight response or the freeze response. It's going to trigger a response that will get you away from danger that doesn't require you to think about it. And that's like if you touch something hot, you jerk your hand away. You don't think about it first. You don't sit there, should I move my hand or should I let it burn up? Right? You jerk it away. Yeah. So your amygdala is really good at getting you out of trouble when there's real trouble. The problem is, we've also learned that the brain doesn't have an ability to discern between something that's actually happening and something that you're just imagining that's happening. And so, as we mentioned earlier, and so the hippocampus turns out that the switch between whether your response goes to the amygdala and you run away or your response goes up to the frontal lobe and you think about the situation, and your frontal lobes are your big, massive billions of neurons of processing power to help you make good decisions. They're rational and reasonable and logical, and you can think about things and choose a response that's going to help you. And so it turns out that the hippocampus has this one-way switch. You're either going to be anxious or you're going to be in your frontal lobe response. And the switch that moves it from one to the other is gratitude. So reliably, if you can think about something in a moment that you're grateful for, that I'm glad I have a brain, I'm glad I have a frontal lobe, I'm glad that that there's not actually a bear coming at me to kill me right now. If you can just think of something instead of the anxious thought that you're focusing on, if you can think of something that you're grateful for, your frontal lobe will get involved and you'll choose a better response. than just fight or flight. And so I find it interesting when you say, how do you connect faith and science? I find it interesting that that's one example of about 20 that I can give you where scripture prescribes something that will lead to human flourishing. And then neuroscience identifies and proves it. And that prescription turns out to be correct. Like, so here the Bible says, and it's kind of an inside joke, I think, that Paul chose the word guard here because he says the peace of God will guard your hearts if you choose gratitude over anxiety. And the hippocampus is the guard dog of your brain. Like, it's guarding you from anxiety and helping you choose a better response. So that's one kind of long-winded way to say that neuroscience never invalidates a prescription that scripture writes for human flourishing.
Okay. As I was reading this, I was reading this book from a number of lenses. One, just personally, two, obviously, as somebody who's going to have this conversation with you. But I was reading it also through my lens of my various friends who are working in mental health as counselors, as psychiatrists, and so forth. And I guess one possible response that those folks might have that I was channeling was, well, this is all great. This is all true, but it's not anything new. The idea that our thoughts can change our outcomes, can change our minds, or can change our brains and can change our bodies. That's sort of kind of taken as a classic cognitive behavioral therapy to use one field, right? So help us understand more, like, what's different or new about this from just classic therapy, classic cognitive behavioral therapy. What is it about the neuroscience part of it that adds an extra richness or dimension to this?
I think several things. One, that it's not metaphorical or a way of thinking about how you can be better in your life. It's structural and literal, and we know that now. So one thing is that the idea that a person has to have an outside agent to help them investigate and engage change is a little bit challenged here, because now we know that it's the decisions that you make internally that drive this structural change. And so if you're a therapist, what you want is for your client or your patient to say, I understand that the therapist can't actually change this for me, that I have to do this changing on the inside. And when I decide to take up that role, which I call the patient to doctor switch, where you decide you're going to get invested in your own treatment plan, if you will, and become this self-brain surgeon, that when you make that decision, now you're operating your nervous system from an empowered perspective. You're choosing agency and control and an internal locus of control. And so I think a good therapist will say, hey, we want patients who understand that they need to take command of this process for themselves and drive this process. But we also want them to understand that it's not a way of thinking about their life, and it's not something that should be used from time to time, but it's rather a way that we need to be engaged in our mind-brain interface all the time. Because once you understand what neuroplasticity is, that neurons that fire together, wire together, is this famous Hebb's law that we say. Once you understand that process is happening 24/7 and you have to drive it for your own benefit, and once you understand that, if you choose to treat it as a metaphor or as a way of thinking, then you're going to spend more time in your old ingrained habits and less time in the change agency mode. And so I think what therapists are coming to understand is that we are now able to say people have tremendous ability to structurally change their brains 24/7. And if they think of themselves as victims or broken or unable to change, they're giving that agency back to their brains instead of to their minds where they can fix it.
Okay. Yeah, I still think that what you're articulating is what a lot of really good therapists would say is what they're trying to do. It strikes me that one of the things that's really helpful about what you're bringing, though, is that you are giving this sort of brain level kind of image of what is happening. Not even just an image, an actual sort of described snapshot of what is happening, versus just telling them, yes, you can change how you think. You're actually showing the almost mechanism of how this happens.
And I think most people, just to follow up on that, I think most people, especially people who aren't engaged in therapy or haven't engaged in the mental health space, don't know that they even have this possibility. And because most people don't ever get into that metacognitive state where they're thinking about what they're thinking about, most of us live our lives just reacting to our thoughts and feelings. And so I think what's new about it is if somebody hasn't ever thought about this stuff, to find out that they can get involved in it, I think is a game changer for most people.
Yeah. Well, and this idea that you just mentioned about how we can switch from our one part of our brain by our hippocampus to our frontal lobe through just the act of gratitude, I think is a great example of how, neuroscience can help us. Hey, I'm on a move my approach to this life from this one part of my brain to another.
That's right.
I'd love you to coach me on this, right? Because when I think about these sort of mental ruts, this looping thought patterns that you describe, I was trying to think about when I read that part of your book about, boy, how does that work for me? And I realized, wow, I know one way that I tend to get into these kind of ruts that I think is happening in this lower part of my brain is when I feel like I'm being unfairly accused of something. And that older part of my brain interprets it as an attack. And and it's an unfair attack, but it's an attack. And my brain starts rehearsing kind of defenses against that attack. I'm in fight mode, so to speak, when that happens. But it's not serving me well, because it's like you said, I'm imagining the inactual attack happening to me in real time. And so my brain is in that moment just rehearsing over and over again. I think it's going over and over again because each loop is not actually successfully removing this imagined threat. And so it's kind of going back to the same well over and over again. So coach me through be my doctor. I'm your patient. I'm coming to you I've got this problem. My boss told me that, I'm not doing a good job on X, and I just can't do anything but think about X and defenses against his critique. What moves do I make in that kind of situation?
So I think the first thing is to say, if you came into my office and you told me you've been having headaches, okay, let's just take an example here. You say, hey, doc, I've been having headaches. If the first thing I said, Curtis, was, well, let's just go to the operating room and let me cut your head open and I'll look around and see if I can find a problem. Like, you would say, wait a minute, like, you need some information before you cut my head open, right? Don't you need to do a scan or something? You need to get some information before you go doing surgery. So that's just an example of that we need data before we make a decision. And what most of us do, that situation you just described, when you feel threatened, you react in a particular way every time. It's because you have decided that threat is true and you're reacting to it because you think it's true. But if you can recognize that the science is pretty solid, that about 80% of the thoughts that pop into your head aren't true, like most of the things that we automatically think and feel aren't true, then you can say, well, instead, if I can look back at the past times that I've reacted in this way, and it turns out maybe I wasn't being attacked, or I said something that I had to then later apologize for, or I had a fight with my boss that turned out not to have been necessary because he wasn't really attacking me, or whatever. If you can look back at the past and say, I've made some mistakes before because I reacted to something emotionally instead of thinking about it frontal lobe-ishly, if you will, then you can say, well, maybe I need to develop a process, like Dr. Warren just said in the office, like he doesn't just cut my head open, he gets a scan first. Like the process, I call it the thought biopsy, like where you instead of reacting to the thought as if it's true, you think about the thought for a moment first. You put a little space in there. So when I feel threatened, I need to think about that for a moment before I react to it. Is he actually threatening me? Well, if he is, what does it matter? Does it change the outcome for me? If I react and I get angry, am I solving the problem effectively, or is there a better way for me to deal with it so that we work through it and I end up with a better solution? Like, so you think for a second before you react. And so you ask some questions about the thought. Is this true? Is it 100% always true? If it's true, is it necessary for me to respond to it right now? Or is this the best time and the best manner in which I could respond to it? So you build a little set of questions that you ask yourself about the thing you're thinking or feeling, and then you decide how to respond to it. So if you're having this repetitive problem over and over of feeling threatened and reacting emotionally to it, and it's not working out for you very well, then build that system and run those mental reps, those visualization steps of practicing this encounter and trying to work towards a good outcome. There's a thing in business they call the pre-mortem analysis. You probably know about that. You're a business guy. Pre-mortem is like you look ahead. If this thing fails, what would the steps have been that led it to fail? right? If this thing goes off the rails, like what would have happened in order for it to have gone off the rails? And then you can reverse engineer and say, well, then let's go forward and keep it from going off the rails, right? So you can do a little pre-mortem analysis in your brain before you respond to that situation and say, if I react in this way and this conversation ends up causing me trouble with my job or my boss or my marriage or whatever, how can I reverse engineer that and take some different steps instead and wind up with a better outcome? So Hebb's law, this neurons that fire together, wire together, will kick in and begin to build a practice for you that becomes more habituated over time. So instead of kicking into those ruts of negativity that you've been describing, you'll start kicking into a rut that will help you make that better decision, because what you keep doing, you get better at neurologically. So you have this ability to know for sure that if you repeat this pattern of thinking ahead of that, running the pre-mortem analysis, questioning your thoughts, building something that's true, and choosing a better response, that will become your default behavior over time if you practice that enough. That the old pathway there's a thing called synaptic pruning, where that synapse will literally go away if you keep repeating the new one long enough. So you can build a brain that will support you to have a better outcome in that situation if you just keep running the play in your head before you get into the field.
Lee, I guess that gets to that part of your concept that I think is so provocative of a term that you call self-brain surgery. And I actually want to zero in on the term self, because it seems like, well, any self could do all of this. And I guess I start wondering, does this concept, self-brain surgery, run the risk of centering the self, of saying, hey, I can do it. I can change my mind. It is within myself to do this. And thus reinforcing, our classic Western conception of the autonomous self, free of it, able to exercise autonomous authority at the center of the world, the center of all change. And that's not the Christian view of the self or the reality. And so how do you integrate this concept of self-brain surgery with the role of the Holy Spirit?
That's a great question. And it's one I've thought about it a lot, because I don't like the term self-help really in general. But I think there's a difference between self-help and self-reliance. And so if you think about the fact that if you put yourself in the metaphor of being a surgeon, right? Like, I'm a surgeon, I practice this for a living. There's cases, in fact, almost every case, where I recognize if I'm going to be a wise and compassionate physician who's doing the right thing by my patient, and in the context of self-brain surgery, you're the doctor and the patient, right? You're both. So if I'm going to take care of my patient well, I'm a neurosurgeon, but I'm not a cardiologist or a psychiatrist or an endovascular specialist or any. There's a number of specialties that I don't have a lot of training and expertise in. So if I'm getting a patient ready for surgery and they start having chest pain, then I'm not a cardiologist. I don't have the expertise to deal with that problem for my patient. So as a wise surgeon, rather than barreling ahead with taking care of them myself, I'm going to consult a cardiologist, somebody that has the expertise and the training to help me manage my patient in the right way. And so I think of mental health professionals and psychiatrists and counselors and pastors and chaplains and other people as necessary consultants to call in when we're trying to care for ourselves, including the Holy Spirit. Like to say, I know that God expects me to be the one to pick up the scalpel and do the work. He's not going to do the work for me, but he has given me a brain and a mind that will support me making these decisions. The Bible says very clearly, God works within you to will and to act in accordance with his good will, his good pleasure. So he put the systems in place for me to operate the system in a way that will help me and not hurt me. He's put the Holy Spirit inside me as kind of a wise advocate or a professor to help me and advise me. But he's not going to do the work for me. He expects me to have some skin in the game and decide I'm willing to take my thoughts captive, as 2 Corinthians 10:5 says. I'm willing to work with him to give me the mind of Christ, as he says. So it's not that I'm responsible for the change. It's that I'm willing to operate under his guidance that he's called me to do. And when I need help, I'm willing to get it and I'm willing to ask for it. And so I think a wise and compassionate person who's trying to care for themselves and love themselves. In fact, Romans chapter 12, verse 1 says that presenting our bodies to God is an act of worship. And Romans 12, verse 2 says, don't be conformed anymore to the pattern of the world, which is self-reliance. Like the world says, take care of yourself, follow your heart, live your truth, do all those things. But instead of being conformed, he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Let him change you. Let him transform you. That work of the Holy Spirit that happens inside of us doesn't choose our thoughts for us. It provides us with alternative thoughts that we can choose to think. And so it's not self-reliance. It's helping ourselves obey him, work with him, be benefited by the fact that he's done all this work and given us all this this wiring that can change in response to our thinking. He's done all that for us. So we don't need to pray for a miracle. We need to operate the system that he's miraculously made for us.
Lee, if I had to just summarize in perhaps a oversimplistic way, what you seem to be saying, it would be something like this, like, hey, change your thoughts with the help of the Holy Spirit to change your life.
That's right.
And I think you've given a lot of evidence for how that can work. But then I put on my pastoral hat. I imagine people I've pastored over the course of my life, people who are suffering depression for years, who are in a really unhappy and dysfunctional marriage, who are alienated from their kids, or we can go on, who are suffering from chronic pain. And if I were to just say to them, hey, just change your thoughts, parentheses, with the help of the Holy Spirit, and you can change your life. I feel like I can't say that, at least not in that first meeting. It feels like too simplistic, and they're going to be like, well, it's easy for you to say. And so what we're getting at is just, I believe in the power of changing your thoughts, but it's not that easy. It's really hard. So, put on a combo of our neuroscientist and pastoral hat. How would you respond to these people who are going to respond to the first statement as, what are you talking about, man? I've been trying, or it's not that simple. It's really hard to do that. What would you say?
Well, first of all, I acknowledge, okay, I've been to war as a member of the United States Air Force. I've been traumatized. I've had PTSD. I've been through a divorce. I've lost a child. Life is not easy, okay? And nobody's saying, least of all me, that all you have to do is just change the stuff you think about. It'll all get better. They're not saying that. But if you think about what kinds of things do produce change, there's really only three things that can change. There's circumstances that can change, there's other people that can change, and there's me that can change, us. And of those three things, only one of them actually makes you ever feel better. Like, because when circumstances change, it temporarily makes things feel better for you. But then the next hard circumstance will come along and you won't feel good again, right? And when other people change, again, it makes you feel better for a while, but you're still you and the situation is still generally the same. And those people are going to let you down again in some way, again in the future. And the target keeps moving. So if you have, the psychologists call it an external locus of control. If you believe that something outside of you or someone outside of you has to change in some way for you to be okay, then that you're never actually okay, because the target will keep moving and you'll never actually be satisfied, because until you change inside yourself, you can't actually accomplish anything that makes your life better. So although I'm not saying it's easy to just change your thoughts, and I'm not saying that that's all that's necessary, I am saying that Hebb's law and the neuroscience is clear that nothing will change until you begin to change the things that you think about. And so since we know that what keeps us in a rut is that the fact that about 90% of the things we think are the same things we thought the day before, and we begin to believe that we're unable to change. And the reason we're unable to change is that our thoughts are what generates how our brain structurally remodels itself every day. And so until you choose a different set of things that you're going to think about every day, I'm not just saying replace negative thoughts with positive ones. That's not the answer at all. But until you say, okay, if I've been experiencing a life with this type of outcome, then I know the only thing that can really change is me, that'll make a difference in what my brain does. Then I have to find a different perspective from which to view the things I've been going through. And that will change the set of things that I'm thinking about in response to that perspective change. And that's why I told this story of the guy Leonid Rogozov in chapter 1 of the book. And just briefly, I'll tell you that story. It was 1961. The Soviets sent an expedition to Antarctica. And one of the team members, the 13 team members, was a young doctor named Leonid Rogozov. And he was the only doctor on the team. And they got to Antarctica, and the plane left, or the boat left that brought them, and the ocean froze, the winter came. And shortly after they were there, Rogozov got sick. He developed appendicitis. So he's the only doctor on the team, and he's got appendicitis. And if you don't have an appendectomy, you're going to die, right? When you have an appendicitis. And so Rogozov was in trouble because there was not another doctor there who could take care of him. He was the only one. And so he despaired, of course, and was scared, and it was dying and was hurting. And then he realized that he actually had the training to take care of the problem. He had the ability to take care of the problem if he could change his perspective from being this patient who was unable to be helped because there wasn't another doctor, to being the doctor that he already knew how to be. And he held a mirror up and trained a mechanic to hold instruments for him. And he took his own appendix out, and he saved his life because he was able to mentally make that shift from patient waiting on somebody else to come along and fix the problem to engaging with the training and skills that he already had to remove the problem for himself. And so nobody's saying you just need to switch one thought for another and it's super easy. What I'm saying here is that you have this God-given process inside you where your mind will change your brain. And when your brain changes, your neurotransmitters change, your hormones change, your body changes, your epigenetics change. Everything in your life changes when your brain changes structurally. So if you can decide that it is quite literally the responses to the situations that you're in that's been creating the realities that you're living. And if you can change the things you think about, you'll change those responses. That's when real change begins to be possible for you.
I'm reminded of Reinhold Niebuhr's classic Serenity Prayer. It's the one that says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. The reason why I thought about that prayer was, it seems like one way to describe what you're trying to do in this book is to expand the scope of things that, with courage, that we can actually change.
That's right.
That there's more in our lives that we can change. We're not just the captive of our existing brain and its thought patterns, and that we can actually put into some practices that expands things we can change. And I do think it takes courage. I think it does take kind of a decision to get out of our current ruts that we're in, and we're stuck often in our ruts because it's scary to get out of them. So
that's right.
So I like that idea. Okay, courage to change. But it also describes that serenity prayer, the wisdom to know the difference, that there is a realm of things that I cannot change, and we need to have the serenity to accept that. And it seems like it does take wisdom to do that. The example you gave of that Russian doctor in the North Pole, he did expand the range with courage of things he can that he could change, but there were things that he couldn't change. He couldn't change the fact that he was alone, that he was in pain, that he was, in a life-threatening circumstances. So in that vein, how do we know the difference? How do we gain the wisdom to know the difference? Because there is a difference, and it actually is problematic if we don't recognize the difference. And I'll share just from my own personal life, since you've been so transparent in sharing about your life. I've struggled with various forms of chronic physical pain, my back, I've had headaches, like all this stuff, right? And one body of literature that tries to expand the range of things that you can actually change is this literature that's especially popular in the last 10 or 20 years called the mind-body literature. And it has some congruence with what you're talking about, saying that, look, pain is very much a mind phenomenon. So if you change your mind, you can change your experience of your pain. And I actually believe in the science behind that. I believe there's some truth to that. And they've given all these practices to do that. I've practiced them diligently for years sometimes. And it's provided some ancillary help here and there. It has not really meaningfully changed my experience of my pain. That has remained outside the actual experience of the level of pain. Has not totally changed. I mean, maybe it's moderated some. What has changed is my approach and my response and my fear of that pain. So but the underlying physical condition, I've not been able to change really in a meaningful way, not in the way that you could change with a scalpel to an aneurysm or something like that, or a tumor. And so I need to recognize the difference between what I can change and what I can't. And I think a risk of people like me whether it's physical issues or other people who are, encountering your book for psychological or emotional issues, is that when we hear a book confidently proclaim, you can change your life in this way, we can start thinking, oh, I just need to adopt these practices and my life will change in the way I want to. And when that doesn't happen, there's something about some forms of this literature or our own voices start saying, oh, it must be me. I must be doing something wrong. And you get into this loop of blaming the victim, right? I'm not saying your book does that, but I think any book that proclaims a new way of changing your life or try this, this is new, runs the risk, I think, of this dynamic where it doesn't produce the results that people are hoping for, or even that are proclaimed as possible in a book. And people end up feeling like worse. They feel like it must be me. There must be something wrong that I'm doing. So I know it's a long wind up to a question, but I guess I'm asking you, how does your approach, or how do you personally guard against this risk of not knowing the difference, not recognizing the wisdom of what we can change and what we cannot change?
Well, I think thank you for sharing that. And I think part of it goes back to my history as a practicing neurosurgeon. And the two books I wrote before this, actually the second book that I wrote was, I've Seen the End of You. And it was about my experience with people with terminal brain cancer. And so I had all these encounters with people in my career with a particular brain tumor called glioblastoma, which is basically always fatal. Pretty much everybody that gets that disease dies, and the 5-year survival rate is something like 1 in 10,000. So it's really bad news if you get that diagnosis. And I started noticing how people respond when they receive a diagnosis like that. And some of them encounter that hardship, Curtis, and they just crumble emotionally. Their quality of life crumbles. And then even the ones that have a better outcome than we expected, and they live longer than we expected, they're still not okay emotionally. They're wrecked by this bad encounter that they have with this terrible circumstance. And then there's other people that were sort of down and out, and they get this diagnosis and they all of a sudden kind of come alive, and they find out what their life's about, and they re-engage with their family for the time they have left, and they sort of improve, and their life gets better in response to having engaged this difficult diagnosis, right? And there's other people that were kind of solid. They had a belief system. They encounter this bad news. It doesn't really wreck them. They kind of hold on to their quality of life. And so I learned from studying all those people that there's a difference, and we need to discern it. We need to call it out. There's a difference between your circumstances and your ability to flourish in your life. So we can't define flourishing, abundance, happiness, quality of life. We can't define that by what happens to us circumstantially. And so if we can just separate those two things out for a second, I would say that when I'm talking about changing your life, I am not saying that you have the ability to architect a particular outcome of the circumstances of your life. But I'm saying that it's clear from scripture, it's clear from neuroscience, it's clear from my experience as a bereaved father, as a trauma victim, and as a practicing neurosurgeon. It's very clear that people can encounter hard things and it can serve to improve their lives in some way over time. And the Bible said that too, Romans chapter 5, suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope. And so there are ways in which learning to think about things and change our perspective on things can improve our quality of life. And actually, sometimes it's because of the hard thing that we went through that we find our way to a higher quality of life than we had before. And so this process I'm describing of self-brain surgery, in one sense, can be said to help us separate circumstances from our ability to flourish in them. And you can't ever expect a particular outcome regardless of how you think about that thing, or regardless about how hard you try to change your mind about it. You may still have chronic pain. You may still have a shortened lifespan because of your disease process. But I think, as you have shown us, you can still have a very high quality, meaningful, and purpose-filled life in spite of that problem, right? And so I think that's the first thing, a long-winded way to say, like, make sure you separate flourishing from circumstance, because you can achieve flourishing. I've proven that with many brain tumor patients. They can have flourishing, abundant lives that are much shorter than they thought they were going to be, because they still matter and they still understand what their lives are about, right? In the setting of chronic pain, there is some really fascinating research that shows, as you said, chronic pain is a memory connection and a neuroplasticity of memory in your brain rather than an ongoing physical ailment in many cases. And so that means, if you can learn to understand that what you're feeling is more about the emotional state that your brain is tying into a memory of that event than an actual ongoing event, that seems to be the most hope. That seems to be where the most hope lies in terms of managing chronic pain, is understanding the memory processing and retrieval circuits in the brain rather than there being an ongoing physical problem. Because what a lot of people do is they believe that if they feel pain, there's a disease process happening. And they can't separate the fact that it's actually something that your brain is doing rather than an ongoing actual physical illness. And so I think I gave you, in fact, a chapter in the book about chronic pain and about dealing with those kinds of things. So I think there is some hope that this process that I'm describing can be beneficial to people with chronic pain syndromes and chronic illness. But it's also important to understand that the way we think about our circumstances needs to be separated from whether or not we think we have a high quality life.
Lee, I read your book right after a family trip to Taiwan, where I was born. I came to the States when I was 3.5, and we went with my family, my sister's family, and so it was all of our extended family. And what was really wonderful about that was the ways in which that trip connected my daughters and their cousins to my past, my ancestors and so forth. There was by living there, or by visiting there, they were sort of connecting in a very tangible way. And so it was a really interesting experience of me standing at the intersection between my past in this land that I grew up in and my future in terms of my daughters and their generation, right? And it made me think about this biblical view of how we're supposed to live our lives from a generational lens.
Yeah.
Like many verses in the Old Testament, like Deuteronomy 5:9, talk about this concept that, what we do can last to the third and fourth generation.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about that already when I read in your book this concept of epigenetics. And I was like, whoa, there's actually science behind this idea of intergenerational influence. So can you say more and explain about that concept?
Yeah, so most of us, 1953, Watson and Crick gave us the structure of DNA, right? So famous two scientists that figured out what DNA was. They won the Nobel Prize for that. And since 1953, there's been this idea of what's called genetic determinism. And most of us have been taught that the genes we inherit tell most of the story about how our life's going to play out. Like you're going to be pretty or you're not going to be pretty, you're going to be tall or short, you're going to be overweight or not, or you're going to be athletic or not, or you're going to be talented or smart or whatever. We think that's because of the genes that we inherit. But it turns out that the genes actually are a small part of what turns out to be true in our life. There's something called epigenetics, which is the science that's only just now beginning to be understood of which genes get turned on and off and in what sequence they get turned on and off is far more important to how your life turns out than what genes you inherited. And that's interesting if you look at identical twins, for example. They don't get the same diseases and they don't have the same lifespans and they don't live the same kinds of lives because they have different epigenetic switches that happen during the course of their lives that produce different genes turning on and turning off, and that produces different lifespans and different disease profiles. And so it's interesting that we learn that people who have gone through hard things, like there's good research in Holocaust survivors, for example, that those people who encountered significant trauma during their lifetimes, their children are born with abnormal stress responses, high cortisol levels when they're born, even though those children have not been through those hard circumstances. And they figured out some of the genes involved in that now. And it turns out to be epigenetics that alters your stress cortisol response, and that can be passed on to your children. And then it turns out that switch can persist for 3 or 4 generations in people who have never encountered the hard thing that their grandparents or great-grandparents went through.
Wow.
And so when the Bible talks about what we call generational curses sometimes, hey, the sins of the fathers are going to be visited on the 3rd and 4th generation. Rather than being a curse, I think it's actually kind of a warning. Like, hey, the stuff you do in your life, the things you encounter in your life, your kids and grandkids and great-grandkids are going to deal with some of that stuff. So be careful how you live, right? So pay attention to the choices that you make. The beautiful part about that is it's been shown in mice and it's been shown in humans now that if you change how you handle stress, for example, you can reverse those epigenetic switches, and your children can be born with normal stress responses, even though you had the gene switching that was abnormal. And so that means in one generation, you can undo some of the things that you inherited from your parents. You were born afraid of things you didn't encounter, but your kids don't have to be born afraid of them, because if you get it right in your generation, your kids will be born with a more normal response. And so that's the beautiful power of epigenetics. It's not just about the parents that gave you the genes that you inherited. It's about what genes get switched on and switched off. And now we know that thinking and the things that we think about and the way that we process stress and the way that we manage things is the switch that turns those things on and off in many cases.
Lee, you're a doctor and used to seeing many patients, and in those office visits, I know that you are used to delivering life-changing news to your patients. You've got cancer, or you've been cured of your cancer. And I know that for myself, as a patient who's seen various doctors, sometimes they can give me a flurry of information, but the thing that I will hear the most is the last thing that the doctor tells me. So I'm going to give you that chance to our listeners who've heard a flurry of information and great insights from you. What's the last word you want to leave with them that you want them to hold on to?
I just want you to know, friend, as a bereaved father who's figured out how to live again, and as a surgeon is the guy that delivers this news, like you just said, Curtis, I want you to know that how things have been for you does not have to be how things will be for you. That as soon as you decide that you're willing to operate the system that God gave you according to the way that he designed it, and that you were actually designed to heal and grow and change and flourish rather than be easily broken. As soon as you make that decision, then you can start engaging with this process, and the future can be different than the past has been for you. That you have agency and you have control. And the social scientists tell us that hope is built on agency and opportunity. And if you have those two things, you can be hopeful. And so I want you to be hopeful that there's a process and there's a plan and there's a path for you. No matter where you've been, the future doesn't have to look the same.
Lee, that's a great last word of hope. Thank you so much for being our doctor for at least this podcast, and for introducing your book. It's The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery, Connecting Neuroscience and Faith to Radically Transform Your Life, by Dr. Lee Warren. Lee, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Curtis. God bless you.